how to go independent. Today I will be talking about how to compare a potential package from a wirehouse firm, an upfront deal with other incentives, how to compare that to the possibility of going independent, both financially and from a bigger picture life standpoint. I'll focus on the numbers quite a bit because that's going to drive a lot of the comparison. It's very natural that the big numbers we read about and hear thrown around from recruiting deals are going to get our attention. That's what they're designed to do, and they do a good job. I still like to look at those and do the math and think about the amount of money that would come my way if I were to make a switch, which very few people do, but that's for another episode. So we'll get into the details and answer the question, is an upfront recruiting deal better than going independent? Or when would it make sense to do one or the other? A couple points to consider from my perspective. I will try to be as balanced as I can, and I think I'll be able to do that because in my career, if you haven't listened to episode 1, I did take an upfront recruiting deal from a wirehouse, the first move I made of 2 between firms back in 2005. So that was there were specific reasons I made the choice to do that. You can probably listen to that in that episode. So I did this comparison very thoroughly that time, and a little bit did it the second time. Not as much, but I thought through it very thoroughly. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. So I think I can speak from the perspective of when I would still recommend that. I don't regret doing that. It worked out well for me, so I can speak to that. Certainly, I'm very passionate about independence, but there are lots of reasons why you wouldn't necessarily want to go independent, and the financial benefits of those transition packages are hard to overlook. So first, let's talk about, kind of definitions. I would consider anywhere you get a significant upfront deal to move, call it 100% or more. It's kind of the ballpark that I'm starting at here. So independent firms, some of the broker-dealer affiliated firms, including the one I'm at, do have smaller amounts of money where when you come over, you'll see a little bit of money, not nearly at the same level. So, by and large, we're talking about the major wirehouse firms and some of the other large firms that are going to be paying fairly significant chunk of your revenue to come over. If you're not familiar with that, I guess maybe I should do a separate show with a recruiter or someone who's well-versed in those packages, and maybe I'll do that eventually. This is more from a, how do I frame the decision when comparing an independent model with very little, relatively speaking, upfront money compared to kind of the vast riches of the wirehouse transition package. So with that, let's get into the details a little bit. So the typical package that I'm going to kind of compare to going independent is something that you can find at advisorhub.com. They have a section called The Deal that has what they, I think, believe to be, and is usually fairly accurate from my understanding, the most current deal available. So I'm going to use a deal from, when I pulled this up a while back, was from Wells Fargo. I'm not sure it really matters. I use Wells Fargo because they will take, from my understanding, a wider spectrum of production levels than, say, Merrill or Morgan or maybe UBS. So, we can compare a wider swath of the advisor population. This will all be in the show notes, but might be hard to keep up with in audio, but bear with me. So that upfront deal, as the way I saw it, was when I read this, was 125% upfront of your trailing 12. So if you're doing $400,000, that's a $500,000 upfront check. Then 5 other potential revenue streams or checks that you can get based on various goals. The first one being bringing over 75% of your assets, within the first year, which would lead to a 40% of trailing 12 check. I believe that 40% would be of the revenue at the new firm. But again, I'll have an expert on here to talk about that at some point. The second year bonus would be having 75% of prior revenue. So in that case, again, if you're doing 400, you have to get to 300 in the second year, which again, given normal market conditions, seems very achievable. If you have a book that you've built on your own, you would get 35% of trailing 12 at that point. Again, I'm assuming that's of the second year production. So in my example, it's 35% of 300,000. But again, I'm going to simplify this when I do the comparison. The third year bogey would be 90% of assets and revenue. So again, getting close to where you were when you moved, which again, given 3 years to move and get back up and running is not outrageous, pretty reasonable. That would be 35% of trailing 12. The fourth year, 110% of your previous assets and revenue, and a 30% kicker, 30% of trailing 12 that fourth year. And the fifth year, if you get to 125% of your previous assets and revenue, then you get a 10% kicker. So in that case, smaller dollar amount, but still a little extra. In the $400,000 producer case, you'd have to be at $500,000 in production, and you'd get an extra $50,000 if you get there. You'd have to hit the asset bogey as well. So add that all up, it's 275% of at least the percentages that up to 275%. Again, if I'm correct, and those bogeys are based on and paid out on your new production, it won't calculate exactly, but for simplification, we're going to kind of wave that away and assume it's 275% of trailing 12 is the total package. And that's the number that you usually read about in the trade publications, 275, 300%, 350 of the original number. But I want to get into a little bit of the weeds of that. I probably assume everyone does what I do, which is really spreadsheet this out and think through, what does that mean? And I did this quite a bit before I made my move in 2005 when I did take a package not quite as generous as this, but in the same ballpark. I'll put the spreadsheet on the website, howtogoindependent.com. I think that will make it easier to really eyeball this, but hopefully you can get a sense of it as you listen. So in this example, we're getting 125% up front. Now, that's a nice day. I remember that day in July of 2005. I got 100% of my trailing 12 production, which was a very big deal for me at the time. And it would be a big deal now if I were to get a check for that percentage of my trailing revenue. But one of the big variables I haven't mentioned yet is how long is the forgivable loan? How long is the note? As you may be familiar with, or maybe not if you haven't explored this until listening to this episode or just reading casually in the publications that you might come across, those deals, each part of that structure I described comes with a forgivable note. What that means is if for any reason you leave that firm, the money is not yours. So the way I framed that and continue to look at that is the money isn't really yours until basically it's vested, just like any other asset that you might have or a client might have, deferred compensation, vesting in a pension or a 401k match. Just the way we'd advise a client, I would tell you, as I told myself, I'm assuming a 10-year deal for all these comparisons. Now, again, it might be 9, maybe it's 8, but it's a long time. So, again, you can adjust the math as you see fit, but it's simpler for me to do it on a 10-year deal. So for 125% up front in this spreadsheet, I just basically show each year since the transition, and then how much of the money that you've received, how much is actually vested. So the simplest year is year 1 because you only have that first upfront money that you get. I call it year 0 in this, or the transition date in the comparison. After 1 year, you have basically earned 12.5% of that money, so 1/10 of 125%. So the way I look at that, it's like you got an extra 12.5% payout. So I kind of compare it apples to apples. So if after year one, if for some reason you leave, which obviously there's going to be probably some significant problems if you did that from a transition standpoint, but for whatever reason, say you pass away unexpectedly, you need to retire for medical reasons from you and your family, whatever. Per the contract that you have signed, you only are entitled to keep 1/10 of that upfront money. So if you leave, die, mine. Now again, you have to read the contract to see if that's actually the case. But in general, you or somebody's going to owe, 87.5% back in that scenario. So that's a big deal. So basically, I just did this spreadsheet to show the bonus from the year zero or the transition time. After the second year, you vest another 12.5%. So I just show, years 1 through 10, you're vesting 12.5% of that every year. And then so I have a column for each of those 6 deal pieces that I described, the transition money or upfront or year zero, year 1 bogey, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5. And then each of those in this chart, if you can picture the second column is for the bonus received at year 1. If it's 40%, as I mentioned, if it's a 40% of some trailing 12 number, again, we're going to assume it's your transition, which will probably make my comparison more favorable to the wirehouse deal than not, but I think that's good. I want to be conservative on how I make the comparison. If it's a 40% deal, well, if it takes you 10 years to be vested, where you wouldn't owe it back if you left, that's 4% a year. So in year 2, there's the row that shows year 2, you're going to have the second year where you're vesting another 12.5% from the upfront money, and then you're vested the first 4% of your year 1 bogey. So in that column to the far right, their total extra payout basically that you've now earned is 16.5% in year 2. So again, you really should look at this to be able to demonstrate and see the value of it or representation. But essentially, each year, if you're hitting all these bogeys, and that's a big if, but I'm going to assume that you do, that you get a solid business and you can achieve these, and the market doesn't pull a 2008 on us, or if it does, you're able to grow through it and retain a lot of assets. And each year, the first 5 years, you're adding a new piece. So in the year 5 column, which you don't earn the money until 6 years is over, right? Because in your 5th year you earn it, you're awarded it, and then a year later you earn it. You earn the first 10% of it. So I had mentioned it's a 10% of trailing 12 number. Well, the first year of that, so in year 6 after that 6th year, you've now earned and will retain no matter what 1%. So it's essentially a 1% extra payout each year from in years 6 through 15. So again, years 1 through 10, you're adding an extra 12.5% each year from the upfront money. In years 2 through 11, you're adding 4% a year because of the money you would have been awarded after a year. The money you're awarded after the second year, 35%, trailing 12, would be earned and kept at the end of years 3 through 12. Another 35% in years 4 through 13. 3% a year to add up to 30%, trailing 12, awarded at the end of year 4, and again kept at years 5 through 14. And then the 10% that's awarded at 5 years is earned in years 6 through 15. So if you can just picture a kind of a diagonal line going down, and then I have basically a cumulative column for each year. So I'll just tick those off. Years 1 through 15, kind of the marginal extra payout the way I would compare apples to apples if I wanted to say what's my true net. Yeah, I know I get a bunch of money up front, but now I'm going to have a lower payout than if I went independent. So I need to be able to, how do I equalize those somehow? So this is the way I went about it. So this is the marginal additional payout that you can attribute to your deal if you were to capture every piece of it, okay? So years 1 through 15, here we go. 12.5%, 16.5%, 20%, 23.5%, 26.5, 27.5, 27.5, 27.5, 27.5, 27.5, and then 15%, 11%, 7.5%, 4%, 1%. Now, if you were listening closely, you picked up on that 27.5% per year bulge in years 6 through 10. And the reason that occurs is because in year 6, you've got all 5 of those pieces hitting. So for those 5 years, you're getting paid or earning out or having vested. It's taken 10 years for each piece to vest. Well, they all 5 overlap in years 6 through 10. Year 5, it's only a 1% difference because that last piece is only 1%. But you hear the first 5 or 6 years, it's increasing every year as another piece is layering on top. So what does that tell me? Well, by itself, it doesn't tell me much. I guess it tells you you're going to have a pretty good life if you can make the deal work and get all those pieces. And if you're at a firm you enjoy and a place you like, honestly, when I look at that, I averaged it out. The average of all those numbers, if you average it over 15 years, is 18.3%. So essentially, you can say, well, if you want to go apples to apples, let's say you're getting a 40% payout at this new wirehouse firm, plus some 401k match or whatever other benefits there are of being there. There are some. The employee payroll taxes are covered. And I've done one episode on payout already. I'll probably do several more because there's a lot of nuance to that. But anyways, 18.3% to tack on to your 40% or maybe a little higher. So, that's not a bad payout. If you say, hey, the first 15 years, I'm going to average, let's say, a 60% payout. I would argue and could demonstrate fairly easily it's very possible to do a lot more than that, more than that on a percentage basis and a lot more on a dollar amount with reasonable cost control for a typical practice. But again, 60% is nothing to sneeze at. It certainly demonstrates why people take these deals routinely, especially if they don't really want to mess with the unknowns that independence might create, at least in their head. So the other things that jump out at me is, again, this is only if you don't move in those 15 years and you retain all that. So again, I don't want to be overly paranoid or negative, but that's a big consideration. So, but again, I think it's a very valuable way to frame this is look at when the money is earned. So that's sort of the mechanics of how I would consider this. A couple things. One, again, the payout is going to be in the ballpark of what you might expect for an independent practice. And that's after all expenses. A big thing to consider is this is all income tax. So there's no tax advantage. This is probably the worst possible tax efficiency because all this money, as you know, or maybe you don't, as each year it's vested and becomes income, it's now taxable. So some things that I looked at when I was making this decision and the reasons I decided to pull the trigger, and I'll go ahead and skip to a little bit of the punch of the punchline, I guess. Here's why I would take a deal like this. I would take it if the upfront cash was going to measurably improve or change my life or business in a way that could not be done if you don't have that kind of cash infusion up front. And I'll use my example. In 2005, as I was negotiating the deal, I was 29 years old. I turned 30, I guess, in the middle of that process, about a month before I made the change. Wife was a teacher, did not have any kids yet. Our first kiddo was born about 18 months later. We lived in our first house, which is probably about a 1,350 square foot house in a location that we liked. But I knew that changes were coming in my life. We were planning to start a family. We were hoping she would be able to stay home. And I also wanted to, with my business, I wanted to convert to more recurring revenue, advisory, and trail-based. The firm I was at was not very, they didn't really have many good options for that business structure at the time. So as I tell this story, looking back, there's no way I could have done everything I did in the next 2 to 6 years, or really since then, without pulling the trigger. I was 29. I started this business 3 years earlier. So I didn't have a huge amount of capital set aside, extra capital from being able to restructure the practice on the fly. So I was able to, number one, we bought a slightly bigger house about a year after I made the move. So we were able to do that in the fall of 2006 and kind of lived to tell about it despite what happened in the housing market and the markets after that. So we were able to do that. And my wife was able to stay home with our first child a few months later. And during that time and through the downturn, from the time I made the change in 2005 to till now, I was able to refashion my business to recurring revenue and take kind of the commensurate hit in short-term income. So as I look at kind of where I am now, here 11 years later almost, those are huge kind of life-altering directions. And I was able to do all of them. All of them individually were a big deal. Getting a little more space, then growing the family and having my wife stay home, which was a big deal to us, and being able to refashion the business, fairly early on without the worries of, how much do I need to pay the bills, or do I have some target I have to make from a production standpoint, which Morgan Stanley was good about that. Whereas my previous firm was they wanted to see production today, and they didn't have the capability to do recurring revenue very well. So that is a case where I'd say, a wirehouse deal can be a very effective tool to execute on a kind of an overall business and or life strategy. And looking back, I wouldn't change a thing, I don't think, about how I did that, even knowing what I know now that I made another change. Again, you have to be really thoughtful and careful and take your time, think through all the implications of these decisions. And I don't necessarily advocate making two changes if you can pull it off, achieve your goals with one. But in my case, then moving to independence 4 years later, I didn't even stick out that 5-year deal. So in my case, again, I ended up, I don't think I've talked about this, I ended up paying back the last year of the deal because the timing was right, and I don't regret that in the least bit either. So that's the other thing that, I'll touch on that. So making the move when you have life-changing goals or business-changing goals in front of you that you can't achieve without the cash on hand now. And I thought about going independent after 3 years. I kind of looked at the numbers and talked to some people, but I just decided, trying to refashion all that without the cash on hand to alleviate any worries about cash flow was huge. And then when the market tanked in 08 or early 09, looking back, I can't imagine going through that without that buffer. So again, sometimes cash on hand, even if you don't really own it yet, is very, very valuable. And sure, it was for me and my family. And now my daughter's 9, and it's all kind of well behind us. And sure, we'll have more market turbulence, but now my business is built to withstand that a lot better than it was in 2005. The other thing I would make sure you do before you pull the trigger on taking a deal, if you're considering independence, is make sure you have a backup plan. To some degree, the cash in the bank, in my mind, gave me a backup plan. It was, I'll slog through it. If I don't retain what I think I should, I'll have cash, and I can go find another job and, pay back what I have to and move on. Now, that was not something I thought would happen, and it didn't, but you got to be willing to think, all right, well, what happens if this doesn't go right? If I don't hit the production goals that they've got for me, or you've got to really think through the worst case scenarios. I didn't touch on it, but when I was looking at these, I had year 2 through 5 bogeys, but the more I looked at the incentives, of course, they're lined up to be driven by production. And I kind of made the decision that because of that goal of refashioning the business to recurring revenue, I probably shouldn't even worry about hitting the production bonus. There was a year 1 asset-based bonus, and I hit that. I think it was 80% of assets. I hit that at about 11 months. I think I had 13 months to get there. So that was nice. That created a second chunk, much smaller. I think it was 20% of trailing 12, but very helpful. But I decided year 3, 4, and 5, if I was going to create recurring revenue, I couldn't shoot for these relatively short-term production targets. So I just kind of waved them away and said, that's not what I'm here for. And of course, knowing that I might want to move again anyways, made it a little bit easier, because if I had hit those, well, then I would have owed that money back. So it's a very seductive. Once that money's in your hands, you don't want to give it back. That's just human nature. And I think that's the psychology of these deals is, even if you're smart enough and capable enough to keep the money in the bank, keep it liquid and available, which I highly recommend. And I think any recruiter or manager worth their, well, maybe not manager because they want you to be hooked, but any recruiter or consultant worth their salt will tell you to keep that money available, because if you have a 10-year deal and you get 5 years in and you go through something, I want to say like 2008, but not so much market wide, but your firm is sold, the management changes, the character of the firm changes dramatically, whatever it is, your life changes, that you need to make another change. It's just a lot easier if you can be mentally prepared to hand over the money and get your freedom back, right? So I think it's valuable to have the money, but you also need to do your best to keep the money on hand, unless you're doing something dramatic and reinvesting and you're willing to take the chance that you're stuck there for 10 years or whatever the case may be. Make sure you have the money in the bank to buy yourself out of your deal if possible. That's a very big point. So anyways, that's a summary of what I would look at. Another good, I guess, benefit might be if your 40%-ish payout is plenty for you and you're in a position where you want to bolster your retirement planning. I thought about this as well. If you make a move and you can hang on to that money and just sock it away and look at the compounding effects that it could have for you and your family, that's another way to fund your retirement if you're disciplined enough to do that. I still think, again, as we get into the why not to take the deal, I think going independent can achieve that kind of effect and more. But if you want it to be simple and you don't want to have to mess with picking which, how to affiliate with a particular independent firm or starting your own, that's a way to do it. So if you're 100% disciplined and can get all those bogeys and that's all money that'll be sort of retirement money, then, that's something to consider. Okay, so that pretty well covers the why you might want to consider a wirehouse deal from a financial standpoint versus going independent. So now I'll talk a little bit about some of the reasons why I think you'd want to really think strongly about independence, despite all the potential allure of the upfront money and the other bogeys that a total package could bring. So the first and most obvious issue is if you take one of those packages, you will not be independent. Again, coming from someone who is doing a podcast about being independent, that shouldn't be a surprise. But just keep that very foremost in your mind if you're looking at the different options out there and you're not real happy at your existing firm, or you're unhappy enough to look around at leaving. I think you really want to consider, is the next place you go going to be that much different? I've heard stories. In fact, Gerald Robinson, in a recent episode of this podcast, talked about his move. Well, first joining a firm new to the industry because of a particular branch manager. Then I think making a move to another firm because of a specific person or branch manager. And in both cases, those people were gone soon after. So if you're joining a very large firm because of one person's personality or talents or skill or your relationship there, keep that in mind, that unless they own the place, they are not guaranteed to be there. And even if they own the place, they might sell it. They could change. Something could change. So you want to make sure, certainly, that you have good relationships or you feel comfortable with who you're going to work for. But you also need to look at what are the odds of that person being there the rest of your career. In many cases, it's not very high if they are an employee, particularly if you're in a branch or location that's not the pinnacle of that manager's profession. So if I'm at Merrill or Morgan Stanley and I'm in a smaller metro area, if I'm really good, the odds are I'm going to want to go get promoted into a bigger location, because usually that's how you make more money. So keep that in mind. Can't really count on anyone being there forever if they're an employee. The next big issue, and I think I addressed this a little bit in how I would compare apples to apples, the payout comparison. I would argue that in many cases, if not most, your net payout over the life of your deal is not going to be any higher than if you had your own practice. In fact, it might be lower in a lot of cases. Again, there's a lot of variables there. Depends on how you manage your business if you're independent. Depends on how much of your package you're able to realize, depending on how many of the bogeys you hit, etc. But I think, if you're looking at a 60% payout, as I demonstrated with the, how to amortize the cost of your deal, the benefits of that package, I think that's a very low comparison threshold to overcome. In fact, in an article from Investment News on February 22nd of 2016, Danny Sarch has a good column. The title is "Breakaway Advisors Want Their Freedom, Not Bigger Payouts." When I first read this, he's advocating or talking about the freedom and the flexibility that advisors want. And he makes the argument that $1 million advisor is not really going to make that much more. He uses 60% as his quote unquote, payout for an independent business owner, as he calls them. I think that's low for the $1 million advisor. Again, it depends on how they set up their practice. You can certainly spend enough money to be down to 60%. But if you're at 60% at $1 million, you're probably spending more than I think is necessary. In fact, in the first paragraph, he says when a $300,000 producer breaks away, he'll go from 30% payout as an employee to 60% as an independent. So I know he's simplifying, but my first thought was, well, a $300,000 producer will net a lot less payout-wise than a $1 million producer, because the $1 million practice will have some economies of scale, some leverage that the $300,000 practice doesn't have. So in any event, the point of this article, this column, is 60% is kind of the going rate for payout. I think that's low, but at a minimum, it's very reasonable. So I guess my point is, upfront money, while it's great to have it right away, if it's not really yours yet, then I'm not sure it's a compelling reason by itself to forego independence to jump from wirehouse to wirehouse. Another huge financial consideration, if you assume that you're financially not going to be any better off year to year from a payout standpoint, which I think is a very safe assumption, at the end of your career or whenever you're ready to hang it up, or if something happens to you before it's supposed to, the value of your business is dramatically different if you own it. You don't own the business if you're an employee of a large firm. You certainly own the relationships, or you should, and be able to move them from one place to another. But in terms of determining who takes over, how much they pay you, how they pay you, that is almost completely out of your hands if you're an employee. I know the wirehouses are refashioning some of those packages, the sunset packages, as they like to call them, but they are the only bidder. So it's nearly impossible to get really the best price. Not only that, you're going to have a fairly limited amount of buyers because they have to be at your firm. Now, again, it is easier to sell with the same broker-dealer or RIA just from a logistical standpoint, but when you're independent, it's a lot easier to move your clients or ask your buyer to move over. But bottom line is, the value of your business, when and if you decide to sell it, is just going to be a lot higher if you're independent. Based on some columns I've read, probably need to get some experts on what the wirehouse sunset packages look like, or do some homework myself. But it seems to me like it's about double the value. And on the open market, advisory-focused practices are yielding somewhere between 2.3 and 2.5 times revenue. Anecdotal evidence that I've seen is it's about half that or a little less for the Sunset deal. So, I mean, for a significant practice, that's a huge dollar amount difference. And granted, it's only a one-time occurrence, but it's a major factor from a total financial picture. And at least as importantly is the fact that you have complete control over who you sell your practice to if you're independent. Whereas if you're at a wirehouse, I would think if you're a successful advisor, you're going to have quite a bit of flexibility, but there are other people involved that just aren't in the way or aren't involved, don't have a say if you're independent. And I think that by itself is so valuable. You've worked, a long time, in many cases, all your adult life to build these relationships and nurture these relationships. And handpicking your successor there aren't many bigger decisions in terms of professional decisions and how it impacts your clients when you're not there anymore. So just the value itself is a huge thing. And then one of the things that I think I did a good job looking at when I decided to get off the track of just putting my head down and building my business at both firms I was at before I went independent is what I would call the unknown unknowns. So, and again, I read some books that made me kind of overthink this at times, but the idea that, things will come along, you can't predict what they'll be, but I really valued optionality, flexibility, the chance to exploit opportunities if I saw them, because I enjoy that. In some cases, the time I spent thinking about this concept might have slowed down me growing my own practice, but it's led to some good things for me. So let me give you an example. Some examples that have happened for me. I'm only using this because it's hard to describe unknown unknowns. And sorry, you slacked me and I got distracted. So I'll use my examples personally because it's hard to describe the unknown unknowns just by nature. They're going to be a little fuzzy. So I'll give you an example. Some things that have happened for me that could never have happened at an employee firm. Now, again, results may vary. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. Don't follow this advice or you'll probably end up bankrupt, living under a bridge, naked and alone. So, there's the disclosure, and may cause cancer. But this is real life stuff that's happened for me. So I went independent in the fall of 2009. A month later, I had someone, an advisor that was in another independent firm, come join me. We had started talking a few months before I went independent. He was at a different place, not really getting what he wanted. And so I was able to kind of link up with him, and that and the advisor who came with me from Morgan Stanley started to start kind of the foundation of the OSJ oversight network. So it came over. I was able to, I guess one thing is I had a part-time assistant that I shared with others. We worked out that arrangement with our assistant, Teresa, who's phenomenal, still helps my network move people over from other firms today. She had capacity, and we were able to work out a deal to share her time and energy. So that's an example of just we as the advisors decide who's going to work with a certain assistant, who we're going to share with. That doesn't happen in an employee firm, or not nearly the level of control, especially if you're talking about sharing. In 2010, I had another advisor come over to join my little group, and she was the first one that I ended up buying out. So buying that first book was someone I had known before, but rekindled a conversation. I worked with her for a couple of years, as I talked about in the what buying books has done for me episode a few back. But so that was it. That was a great deal. We worked out a deal that structure that worked for both of us. Then the following year, I was able to buy another book on completely different structure and terms. I ended up partnering with someone else to help get the finances squared away because she wanted more money up front than the original seller, the first seller. But again, those two practices that I bought, no way would that have happened as quickly and as seamlessly as it did if we were all employees, because there was no one else involved but them and us, and obviously their clients. They made good introductions to me, and that those have been very successful, as I outlined in that other episode. So, buying practices is just a huge thing that I could have never done, or been unlikely, with a lot more red tape and other parties involved, branch managers and other people that really shouldn't, in my opinion, have any say on who clients work with. I think the retiring or leaving advisor is the one who knows their client base, and if they are the ones that need to be comfortable and make the decision on who they will make the introductions to. So those have been huge. During 2011, well, I did a lot of the legwork in 2010 and before, but in 2011, all my kind of research and work started to hit, and so I was able to build a network of advisors that I provided compliance support for and transition support. By early 2012, that was about 20 people. So again, not everyone wants to do that or will do that or should do that, but the point is, it was an opportunity to help other advisors in our industry, and it's worked out well by and large for most of those advisors, if not all, and for me, and for the firm I'm affiliated with. So it doesn't have to be doing that kind of building an advisor network, but if you decide you want to create a collaboration of advisors and build the infrastructure, not necessarily for compliance support, but maybe it's office space and staff, you can build an offering, and see if there are advisors who are willing to plug into it, and you can work out an arrangement. And again, you can build your own business. You could build a business just providing infrastructure and office support and recreating sort of the branch model if you wanted to. That wasn't my interest, but it's done all the time. And you could become a locally dominant brand if that's what you're looking to do, or have a nice boutique feel so you have people you like to work with. That's being able to structure things how you want. I don't know about you. I've never really been in an office I didn't like or enjoy, but if you ever get to a situation where you don't have a choice on who you work with, I'm not sure a little bit more money earlier is going to make you feel any. I don't think it's going to make you any happier. So the unknown unknowns, and all these I'm describing are not just warm and fuzzy. They've made me more money. So I guess my goal in this episode is to somewhat focus on the financial benefits of independence as compared to taking a recruiting deal. So then, in 2011, I got some momentum with this network. In 2012, I realized I probably would need some partners or some other structure to manage what I had been able to build fairly quickly. And so met my partners, who are phenomenal guys. That's been a great relationship. We got together, had about 30 advisors. Now, 4 years later, we have about 60. In that year, in 2012, we created the hybrid RIA, which gave us more leverage in recruiting and retention. So that business has now basically, we've got to the point where my income from that is more than my income from my practice was before I went independent. So, I guess, and I still have the practice that I manage for myself in addition. Plus, we're still growing the network. So, that's probably a somewhat extreme example, but I know people who run businesses on the side, lawn care businesses, people that have other interests that they can pursue, whether or not it makes them money. But there are just a lot of things you can do that I would put under that unknown categories. How you hire assistants and where you find them, and how you manage your expenses from especially your assistant and your space are big issues, and that can drive a lot of your payout differential. Another great example of an outside activity or business is this podcast, sort of a creative endeavor that probably wouldn't even occur to me if I was still an employee. Just so many restrictions. Now, this is not directly related to the business, so that makes it easier. But clearly, I wouldn't be able to do this if I was an employee of a major or large. I was an employee. I would say the firm I'm affiliated with is large, and they're major, but I'm not an employee. And then I guess the last factor I'll throw in, it kind of circles back to the value of the business. It's a combination of the value of the business and the flexibility inherent in being independent. The way I picture if I were to retire anytime soon or want to ease away from the day-to-day running of the practice, I wouldn't probably sell it. I would look for other advisors to partner with and or hire, and I would be involved as the relationship manager to some degree, but I would have some service person, support person, or support advisor, or maybe a really good assistant, basically do all the proactive contact, all the follow-up work, and sort of, I'd hire, for lack of a better comparison, I'd hire a bunch of nurses, and I would be the doctor going from client to client and just do the diagnosis and then let them kind of run the show after and before. And I think, you could find good people that can manage a good number of clients if they're not expected to go out and get more, if they're not expected to make the decisions, if they kind of have a framework, and you could probably pay them pretty well and still net, 30 to 40% of your revenue. So in other words, I'd rather just hire more people and keep my fingers in things and keep maybe net a lower income, but have it in perpetuity. So if I decided I wanted to hire some support advisors and parcel off, 3 or 4 pieces of my client base, the advisors could maybe get some incentive compensation based on those. They would be happy making a good living. Maybe those people bring over some assets. So that kind of creativity obviously doesn't exist in the employee world because there's just not enough to go around when you're starting at 40, 45% payout. There's, when you're starting at 90 or 85, there's a lot more room, a lot more to divvy up. So I think people underestimate the value of that. Even some of us are independent. I think we underestimate that, what that can do for quality of life when it's time to slow down and do other things or potentially do the same thing, just have a lot more time to work on, or just have a lot more time to do what you enjoy doing, or work with only your best clients. So any number of combinations in how to kind of establish your long-term exit from the business plan, even if the exit is, I don't exit, I just keep doing it. I think a lot of wirehouse teams probably have this in place, with all the staffs doing all the behind-the-scenes work. But again, you just have more flexibility to pay those people what you're going to want to pay them to keep them loyal and appreciated, and you're going to have more left over for yourself. So I could probably talk about this for another 48 minutes, but that would get quite boring. So if we do that, it'll be in a different episode. Hope this gives you a sense of some of the things to consider as you compare a recruiting package to the thought of going independent. Hope I was able to do a good job of not dismissing the value of having money in hand. I get the attraction to that, but I think there are just a lot of considerations that you really want to think through that when you really compare it apples to apples. If there's other reasons you want to stay in the wirehouse employee model, that's fine. But financially, I think I just would say be careful not to fool yourself into thinking that upfront money is somehow dramatically better than the financial benefits of independence. Well, that's all for today. Thanks again for listening. If you have time, go to the iTunes review section and give us a review of the podcast. That helps other people find it. and or just tell a friend or a colleague who might find this useful. I'm really enjoying doing the podcast, but sometimes you're broadcasting this out into a vacuum, and I can see that people are listening, but it's always good to hear feedback. So feel free to email me at sean@indfa.com, and I will respond to anybody that shoots me a note. And that's all for today from How to Go Independent. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.